Hey guys, what's up? Producer engineer Alex Scott here with Consordini.com coming at you with another studio tutorial. Today, I want to take a look at a kind of female vocal pop track that is about to be released on a fantastic record that I am honored to have been a part of called None Such Palace. But I want to take a look at the groove that I have going on, okay? The kind of the drum beat or the program beat or whatever you want to call it. I get a lot of questions from up-and-coming producers on how they can make their beats cleaner sounding and more effective and groovier and all this kind of stuff. And one thing that I see a lot of guys doing is using too many elements. You know, it's very easy, especially with just how much technology we have access to today between our DAWs and samplers and all this kind of stuff. It's very easy to start putting in 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 different kick drums because it seems like it's sounding better and better and better. And then suddenly, before you know it, you've got a bunch of kick drums and a bunch of snare drums and like all these different hi-hat patterns and a bunch of percussion stuff. And it's all just it's just kind of a mess, right? And your mix doesn't sound right. And you've got too much going on, basically. And so in this track, I want to show you guys that less really can be more. I have just a few very simple elements going on, and because they are well chosen, well recorded, and well mixed, even though we only have a couple relatively basic elements, it still sounds very full and very rich and very, very cool. So again, the track is off a record called None Such Palace featuring my dear old friend Veronique Van Pelt. She's one of the best vocalists I've ever gotten to work with. The record is called None Such Palace. This particular tune is Like We Did. So if you look here on screen, we have our session pulled up in Studio One. We've got all of our vocals up here. We actually did another video on mixing these vocals, and we used this song as an example. Then we've got a few synthesizers and pianos and that kind of stuff. Guitars, some string elements, bass line. But then down here is really where we're going to be focusing, and that is on our beat, okay? So again, this is very, very simple, but very, very impactful. We have 4 main elements, really 3 main elements, and then a couple of extra things going on. But to get started, let's just listen to a little bit of the track, and then I will go through and start kind of soloing the elements and talking about what I have going on and how and why I chose what I chose. So let's give it a listen.
I go to shows all alone, maybe dumb 'cause I know I'm living life for myself, but it all doesn't help when I see them touch like we did. I wish I couldn't see when I see them kiss like we did. I wonder what it'll be. I hope nothing gets in the way. Will they one day look at couples and say, when I see them touch like we did, I could die. You know most everyone here, but you never appear. You just
So that's the gist of it. And again, it's a very simple beat, but as you can hear, it fills the space nicely. It's a nice driving rhythm. And that has to do with a couple of different things. Namely, the first thing is just we have to be very careful and very deliberate when we're choosing our sounds for this kind of a thing, okay? Again, it can be very easy with as much access as we all have to sample packs and plugins and libraries and all this kind of stuff. It can be very easy to start scrolling through kick drums and going, well, that sounds great. Well, that one sounds great too. Oh, and I really like that one. And suddenly we end up with 6 kick drum layers, and we've got phasing issues, and we've got a ton of like overblown low end, and it can get very, very messy. So I just have 2 kick drum samples, and they're very, very different. And this is like a really big concept to me with layering, okay? So we have our first kick drum. It's got some good low end to it. It's got a fair bit of punch. It's got a little bit of resonance as well, like a little bit of reverberation afterwards, and it even has a little bit of kind of higher mid frequency, mid range type stuff going on. But it's a little bit hollow. There's an interesting hollow characteristic to it, which then when we listen to the second kick drum that I've picked, it's much kind of techier sounding. It's almost got a little bit of distortion and grit on it. It's also resonance, but it's way slappier. It's got more of a, a mid-range, low-mid punch to it. But it doesn't quite have the super subby lows that the first kick drum has. Okay, that's got really nice airy kind of rumble to it, and the other one is more grit and punch. When you put them together, they work really, really nicely. You get a really good amount of even defined low end. You've got a little bit of air. You've got a little bit of grit. You've got a little bit of resonance. You've got good upper mid punch and presence, impact kind of. And that's when you're picking your samples to start layering your drums together. You don't want to just go for kicks that sound good, or whether it's kicks or snares or whatever. You want to go for things that make sense, things that complement each other, sounds that one sound might fill gaps A and B, and then the other sound fills gaps C and D, or A and C, and then the other one is B and D. You know what I mean? You want to think about things where it's like, okay, well, this one's got good low end. This one's got good punch. Those are going to work well together. And you don't want to use like catch-all, really big, aggressive sounds that have a ton of low end and a ton of impact and a little bit of resonance and some grit. You want sounds that are almost a little bit lacking in a weird way, but where one lacks, another one's going to make up for that, okay? But then maybe that one is lacking in the areas where the first one are really present. And so doing that, you can use fewer samples, you're going to have fewer phasing issues, and you're going to end up with a cleaner mix overall. So that's the kick drums. The snare drum sound in this is actually, we have two different sounds. We have a clap, a single clap, and a single snap, okay? That's the snap. And then there's the clap. Okay? Now, these are actually samples that I recorded. I was in Paris a couple of months ago, and we stayed in this very cool old apartment building that had these long concrete hallways just outside of the apartments. And we were in there in the middle of the day. It was dead silent, big, thick, like, post-war walls or something. I don't know when the building was built, but really thick walls with a ton of insulation. It was dead silent in these hallways. And I just noticed that they had this really amazing natural reverberation to them. So I had a field recorder with me, and I just went out and did some snaps and did some claps and recorded those. And I've now am able to use those samples in a lot of songs. So there's actually no additional reverb on those samples. That's all just the natural reverb from the recording. Now, obviously, not all of us have the luxury of going to Paris to record field sounds. So you could easily do this just by recording a snap or a clap on your own and then applying a nice reverb to it and getting a nice big epic sound like that. That's totally fine as well. You don't have to be as fancy as I was about it. But that's it. That's the whole snare sound. And because I'm using both of those, the clap is darker, has more meat to it, and the snap has a lot of top-end presence. If I were to take either one of them away, it wouldn't sound whole or complete. But again, because I've looked at, well, this one's brighter, and it has more top-end to it, and then this one is a little bit deeper. And I've EQ'd them that way a little bit as well, to accentuate those things, respectively. And it ends up with a really nice, well-balanced sound. And that's the meat of the groove for the tune, is just this. But again, because I took my time and I really chose the samples, I would like to think pretty intelligently. That's all you really need for the meat of your groove, and that's the whole first verse, is just those two elements. Now, the other thing that comes in halfway through is this element. Which what this is this is a loop of me just playing hi-hat and snare drum. And on its own, Very simple. It's just a little hi-hat pattern with a little bit of accent on the snare drum. Well, I took that and I applied this futz box, which is a little bit of distortion, with kind of an echoey quality to it. This futz box plugin from McDSP is a really cool distortion plugin. This is the Duck in the Rain preset. So it's kind of emulating a toy microphone and doing a few different things in there. But it's just, it's changing the tonal characteristic to be really unique. It's making the hi-hats less prominent, and it's adding this really kind of interesting dark grit to the snare sound. Then we're compressing and doing some EQing, bringing up the top end to bring back some of those hi-hats, adding some extra punch and some extra saturation to it. And then we're adding a delay. And we end up with this really interesting, organic, kind of gritty element. Now, again, I could have tried to make something like this using more snare drum samples and a bunch of hi-hats and programming a beat over here and then using a drum machine, and would end up being too complicated. But I just played around with some interesting plugins with a very simple, it's a single microphone and just a little hi-hat pattern. So it's one thing. We did a few interesting effects to it, and that, you know, is making so much more impact in the track than it would be if I had 20 different channels of hi-hats and toppers and shakers and all this kind of stuff. That would be too much. So instead, I've taken something really, really simple, and I'm using it to complement the root of the groove. And you can hear it's complex, it's thick, it's interesting, it sounds really unique, but it's still really open and spacious and leaves a ton of room for everything else that's going on in the track, which means you're going to have a cleaner mix. Now, the only other thing that I have going on in the beat comes in the choruses. And this is one of my favorite tricks. Okay, so let's take the effects off this. What do we got? So these are tom-toms on my drum set, okay? Rack tom and a floor tom. And I put t-shirts on them, like, or dish rags, I think, maybe. So I'm completely muting the toms. This is a great pop drum sound that you hear in a lot of places. And you're always like, oh, it's kind of rhythmic, but it's not a kick drum. It's not a snare drum. It's not like a djembe or a bongo or conga or something. What is it? This is a classic trick. You take something like a t-shirt or rags, put them over toms, rack tom, floor tom, and it gives this really dead kind of neutral drum sound. So I just did this very simple pattern. Bop, bop, bop. Da-da-da-bop, bop, bop. That's it. And I looped it and did a little bit of editing, and then we're adding, you know, some compression and gating, a little bit of reverb, delay, and some saturation. And we're getting another one of these elements with a lot of motion. So when we listen to the full groove, again, we just have toms, that little kit layer, kick, snare. That's it. Nothing crazy. No, all kinds of crazy layers and overdubs and everything. Just this simple tom part, a little bit of hi-hat, and then 2 kick samples, and a snap and a clap. And because we're using delays and all this stuff to our advantage, and we're using that to fill the space, as opposed to just trying to add more and more and more sounds, we're taking very simple sounds and just tweaking them in the mix a little bit and choosing the sounds really wisely. We end up with this really pretty big, epic sounding part that's really has a lot of character to it. It's got a lot of grit to it. And then we changed the drum sample a little bit at the end of the song. And you can hear now there's a ride bell. It's the same track as the kit loop from earlier that had the hi-hats. I just played something a little bit different and used a ride cymbal instead. So we could have left the original hi-hat sample and then flown in an additional ride sample and other cymbals and all this stuff. But instead, I just did the same technique. Instead of playing the hi-hat, I used a ride instead, and am affecting it in the same way. And that's where the song really hits its kind of epic stride. And it's really interesting. It's really organic. It's very textural. And when you listen to the whole song, and particularly this last chorus, because we've kept it simple, we have room for bass, 2 guitar layers, piano, 2 cellos, 2 synth pads, another piano sample, a vocal sample, a 15-track stack of background vocals, and a lead vocal. That we have all this stuff going on. And, because everything's placed intelligently in the mix, because we picked our drum samples wisely,
Nothing gets in the way. Will they one day look at couples and say, when I see them touch like we did, I could die. When I see them dance, when I see them move, when I see them feel, when I see
we have room for everything. Everybody has room to breathe. Everything has a spot in the mix. It sounds really clean and open and organic. And it didn't take very much work to put all that together either. Again, we're not using a ton of samples. We're not doing all this stuff, so we're not dealing with as much in the mix. We really, even with these double-tracked elements on the toms, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. We have 9 percussion elements, as opposed to I'll get pop sessions and there's 6 tracks of kick drums alone, and I go, well, half these kick drums I don't even need. Why do we even have them? So that's kind of how I approach layering drums in this kind of a context of pop or electronic context. Now, as always, there's a million ways to do this. You could definitely just have one really great kit in like Machine or Impact or some sampling software and just use that, and you would be in just as good a shape, and that can also keep it really simple. But again, as I've said in other videos, I'm a huge fan of using really organic elements to create tracks, because it sets you apart from other producers. You start to get sounds, no other producer in the world has these claps and snaps that I recorded in Paris. They're totally unique to me. So even if somebody comes to me and says, God, that's a killer sound, what sample library did you get those snaps from? I would say, well, I got them from the sample library of the time I was in this hallway in Paris. Only I have those sounds. So it can really help it to feel really organic, really natural, and really unique to you as a producer. But how do you guys layer your drums? If you have any thoughts or tips or tricks that other people can try out, or stuff that you really like to do, definitely leave them in the comment down below. We always appreciate hearing from you guys and getting your input on everything, so definitely join the conversation. Again, my name is Alex Scott with Consordini.com. Thank you guys so much for watching, and we will see you in the next video.
I go to shows all alone, maybe dumb 'cause I know I'm living life for myself, but it all doesn't help when I see that